Today is Wednesday. It's September the 8th. I am coming to you with today's devotional taken from 2 Samuel chapter 9. The title of the devotion is this: Keeping Promises. Integrity with Compassion. Well, we find David in 2 Samuel chapter 9 resting from his victories on the battlefield and enjoying the blessings of the Lord on his household. David's heart became reflected. Now, we're not told what stirred the king to remember his friend, but a vow he had made to Jonathon, the late son of King Saul, moved him to ask, "Is there yet any that is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now, if you have been following our devotionals with heartofashepherd.com, you may remember the occasion of David's vow to his friend Jonathon. Jonathon had found in David a kindred spirit, and the prince admired the young shepherd who had slain the Philistine giant Goliath. However, as David's popularity grew in Israel, his presence in the palace increasingly provoked Saul's jealousy, and the king had sought to slay him. In spite of his father's malice, Jonathon not only accepted David as his peer, but demonstrated his unselfish love for David and acknowledged that he would succeed to the throne of Israel. Now, 1 Samuel chapter 20 records David's final meeting with Jonathon before his death. And David was a fugitive from the palace, and after barely escaping with his life, had sought refuge in the wilderness. Jonathon, knowing his father meant to slay David, sought from him, David, a covenant that when he would be king, David would not, and I quote, cut off his kindness from Jonathan's house forever. Now, a little bit of the meaning of that. David's kindness. Now, 2 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 1 through 3. When I read, "Is there yet any that is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" I am reminded of the manner of man David was. The house of Saul had been his enemy, but his friendship with Jonathan stirred in his heart a desire to show mercy and compassion to any that might be alive from Saul's lineage. Now, Ziba, a servant of Saul, was summoned to appear before David, and he brought news that there was a son of Jonathan who still lived, but he was lame on his feet. That is, he was a cripple. Mephibosheth, the name of Jonathan's son who was lame, had been dropped by his nurse when she fled the palace after receiving news that King Saul and his sons had been slain in battle. And so we had Mephibosheth, who was a cripple for life. Now, understanding, all Oriental kings of ancient times would have slain their rivals to the throne, but not David. David desired, and I quote in verse 3, to show the kindness of God unto him. Now, what manner of man was the king? Well, he was one whom God had described in 1 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 14 as a man after his own heart. Now, 1 Samuel 9 verse 4 through 8, we read about David's compassion for Mephibosheth. Receiving the king's summons to appear in his court must have frightened Mephibosheth, this man who had spent his life as a cripple. Limping his way into the presence of the king, Mephibosheth, most likely around 21 years old, we read in verse 6 that he fell on his face and did the king reverence. David said, "Mephibosheth," and Mephibosheth answered, "Behold thy servant." David sensed Mephibosheth's fear, and he spoke words of comfort to him, saying in verse 7, "Fear not, for I will surely show thee kindness for Jonathan thy father's sake, and will restore thee all the land of Saul thy father, and thou shalt eat bread at my table continually." What an incredible gesture. Mephibosheth went from a man dependent on the charity of others to an heir of his grandfather's royal lands and a place of prominence at the king's own table. Mephibosheth in verse 8 in humiliation, he wondered aloud why David would treat a man that was no more worthy than a dead dog. With his father and grandfather's lands restored to him, Mephibosheth needed servants to care for his estate. David therefore commanded Ziba, his sons, and his servants to look after Mephibosheth's interest in the estate. Now, I have some closing thoughts for you. Unlike our day when those with physical challenges often flourish in their pursuits, men like Mephibosheth in ancient times were shunned. The thought of a lame man sitting at the king's table would have been preposterous in any other kingdom, but not that of David. The king remembered his covenant with Jonathon, and his integrity demanded he fulfill his vow even to a crippled man. Wow. Herein is grace. For Mephibosheth was honored, and I quote verse 7, 11, and verse 13. He was honored as one of the king's sons, and he did eat continually at the king's table. And we read in verse 13, and was lame on his feet. What manner of man was David? He was loyal, compassionate, caring, faithful, and true. Can the same be said of you? God bless you, my friend. I hope these devotionals are a blessing to you. I'd love to hear from you at heartofashepherdinc@gmail.com. God bless and bye-bye.